everybody. Welcome to our famous Cotton Club. It's great to see so many friends here tonight enjoying themselves in spite of the cover charge. And if you can spare a minute from your merrymaking, I'd like to have the pleasure of introducing the greatest living master of jungle music, the rip-roaring harmony hound, none other than Duke Ellington. Take your bow, Dukey. First number tonight's going to play a brand new little tune entitled The Cotton Club Stomp. Let her go.
The Cotton Club, a Harlem institution from 1923 to 1935, sat on the corner of 132nd Street and Lenox Avenue. The club bustled with white-only patrons, many of whom were celebrities or social elites who'd made their way over to Harlem for what could only be described as an urban plantation experience. On the surface, this club might seem like any other, but poet, writer, and activist Langston Hughes spent much of his 5-decade career cultivating a profound image of the black community as multidimensional and lively. Even when Hughes was not directly attacking the Cotton Club, he used his writing, largely focused on his vernacular style, to contest these deluded notions of what it meant to be an African American during the Harlem Renaissance. The Cotton Club was a popular destination for those who wanted to experience the lively Harlem nightclub scene and to enjoy African-American musical acts with the likes of Duke Ellington and Ethel Waters. Boasting black artists, dancers, and waiters that were more resemblant of butlers, the Cotton Club provided a view of the black community as its wealthy, white clientele wanted to see it, exoticized and happily subservient to white America. Langston Hughes, poet, writer, and activist, was steadily growing in prominence during the 1920s, and by the 30s, he would be known as one of the main leaders of the Harlem Renaissance, an artistic, intellectual, and social movement. By age 19, Hughes' work was already featured in prominent periodicals like the Crisis magazine, one of the most influential journals about racial injustice in the United States. The Harlem Renaissance followed the Great Migration, when an influx of black Southerners moved north in hopes of escaping the racially intolerant Jim Crow South. Harlem quickly became the destination for African Americans of all backgrounds, and especially for African American artists and scholars like Hughes. The movement instilled a newfound spirit of self-determination, pride, and activism in black Americans, validating the beliefs of figures of the Harlem Renaissance that art was a legitimate tool to empower the black community. Hughes was highly critical of the Cotton Club and its portrayal of the black experience, as it directly opposed the ideals of the Harlem Renaissance. While the Cotton Club itself was not the only object of Hughes' reproach, it was a highly publicized example of the way African Americans were seen by greater American society. He wrote, "The Cotton Club was a Jim Crow club for gangsters and moneyed whites. They were not cordial to Negro patronage unless you were a celebrity like Bojangles." He not only opposed the segregationist policies of the club, but the way the black artists and customers were exploited, like amusing animals in a zoo. It was this type of view of African American culture that Hughes wanted to correct, and in doing so, he would express the unadulterated black experience.
I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong.
Hughes evokes Walt Whitman's voice by writing a poem that responds to his original I Hear America Singing. In Hughes' intentional appropriation of Whitman's language and style, Hughes is able to prove that his work has a place in high art alongside Whitman, supposedly the great American vernacular writer. Hughes brings new voices not typically heard in poetry into dialogue, extending the perceived definition of American vernacular writing. The use of the universal I is a means of unifying black identity through the empowerment both of himself and of those who have experienced being sent to the kitchen.
Besides, they'll see how beautiful we are and be ashamed. I too am America.
In presenting Black America as such, Hughes undermines the stereotyped identity of black society as without individual variation. Moreover, he rejects the perceived lesser status of African Americans from institutions like the Cotton Club. I, too, turns historic notions of shame away from himself and the African American community towards the oppressor. Instead, Hughes liberates himself through his writing. Hughes' vernacular spanned across many themes, gender, class, and age among them. For instance, he borrows the female voice in Hard Daddy, expresses an honest reality of economic struggle in Down and Out, and speaks as a kid much younger than himself in children's rhymes, mocking older generations. His interest was not in the spectacular, but in the day-to-day realities of life as a black American. He did not shy away from depictions of the black experience that might not elevate the race as the black bourgeoisie had wanted. Instead, he created Harlem in his vision, using vernacular in both oral and musical forms.
Thump, thump, thump went his foot on the floor. He played a few chords, then he sang some more.
The Weary Blues epitomized Hughes' use of jazz and blues as another poetic tool, the musical mode of vernacular. Not only is the rhythm of the Weary Blues emblematic of jazz aesthetic, but it exemplifies jazz's tie to feeling. In using the blues form in writing, Hughes could portray both sorrow and celebration, or tragedy and comedy. He was able to use not only a multiplicity of tones or emotions, but a multiplicity of black experiences. Weary Blues uses varying vernacular to portray the varying voices of the Cotton Club, of a white, voyeuristic patron, of perhaps a black onlooker, and of a performer himself.
Far into the night he crooned that tune. The stars went out, and so did the moon. The singer stopped playing and went to bed, while the weary blues echoed through his head. He slept like a rock, or a man that's dead.
As writer and scholar Kevin Young writes, in the Weary Blues he would first perfect that mix of hope with heartbreak. Though Hughes has emerged at the forefront of Harlem Renaissance literary figures, his use of vernacular was subject to criticism from contemporaries. Some believed Hughes' work misrepresented, exploited, or misinterpreted the black experience. County Cullen, a black American poet, represented the traditionalist writers of the Harlem Renaissance and fully rejected blues lyricism as a valid form of literary art. James Baldwin, an outspoken critic of Hughes, praised the Weary Blues as literary art. However, he criticized Hughes' language as being oversimplified, hiding from the challenge of articulating the black experience. Negro speech is vivid largely because it is private, Baldwin wrote, but he has not forced them into the realm of art, where their meaning would become clear and overwhelming. Despite criticism, Hughes directly addressed commonly distorted perceptions of the black experience, undermining common criticism and allowing the expression of a multitude of black perspectives. Young said it best. Hughes and other young writers often sought to scandalize as a form of sympathizing with those whom life ain't been no crystal stair. Hughes speaks on behalf of any and all black experiences, some of which he cannot identify with. However, in his use of differing vernacular, he pushes against white notions of one stereotyped African American. Hughes was just 18 when he wrote The Negro Speaks of Rivers, his poem first published in a 1921 issue of the Crisis magazine. This poem speaks to the meaning of being an African American, not just in America, but in the world.
I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers.
The poem is rich with history, extending far beyond slavery in America into the earliest periods of mankind. Hughes illustrates the complexities of blackness rooted in history, as in The Negro Speaks of Rivers, in oppression, as seen in The Weary Blues, and in hope, seen in I Too. In doing so, he unites the black spirit across all facets of life and invites them into the American literary tradition.
This is The Negro Speaks of Rivers, one of my earliest poems written in 1920, just after I came out of high school. The way this poem came to be written was that I was going to Mexico to visit my father, who lived in Mexico City, and on the train going across the Mississippi River, just outside St. Louis, I looked out the window and I saw this great muddy river flowing down toward the heart of the South. And I began to think about what this river meant to the Negro people, how, in a sense, our history was linked to this river, how in slavery time my grandmother told me that to be sold down the Mississippi was one of the worst things that could happen to a Negro slave. And then I remembered that I'd read about Abraham Lincoln going down the Mississippi as a young man, and he went on a raft to New Orleans, and he saw human beings bought and sold in the slave market there, and he was so horrified by this that he never forgot it. And many years later, of course, we know that it was Lincoln who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And so, as the train went on into the gathering dusk, because it had been about sunset when we crossed the river, I took my father's letter out of my pocket and began to write out on the back of his letter this poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers.